Hello! Today I'm sharing the story of John Edden, a man who faced one of the most legendary events of the 19th century and was one of less than 200 who lived to tell the tale.
So I've come to show you a monument today, which is a huge obelisk, and it's to John Edden. Now, two people asked me about this one. One mentioned the name John Edden. The other one just said it's a really big monument to somebody who fought in a war and was obviously very brave and seems to have been forgotten. So with those two clues, I couldn't resist coming and trying to find it for myself. So this one's so tall I can barely get it in one shot, so I'll take you a little closer in a moment. But it's a large obelisk, very prominent indeed, absolutely huge. This person must have been so respected. Let's see if we can find out a little more about him just from the stone itself. So it says up here, in memory of John Edden, born April the 12th, 1833, died October the 15th, 1898. And then on the plinth here, it says, he served his Queen and country for 12 years in the 4th, the Queen's Own, Light Dragoons, had 2 horses shot under him during the charge of Balaclava, and received the Crimean Medal with 4 clasps for Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman and Sebastopol, and the Turkish Medal. And then down to the very bottom of the plinth it says, this monument is erected by the residents in his native town of Tamworth as a token of their esteem and respect for one who so ably did his duty. That is quite an extraordinary tribute. Let's walk all the way round and see what else we can see, but I think it's only what's written on the front. Nothing on the back. Does this mean he wasn't married? Or that he has a spouse lying nearby? Does he have children, descendants? The lady who asked about this commented that her granddaughter particularly likes this monument and comes to see it, and they're also sad that he was obviously so important to the town and now completely forgotten.
John was a labourer's son, born at Alders Mill near Tamworth, probably in 1835. When his father died in 1850, the family fell on hard times, and Mary, his mother, was listed as a pauper in the 1851 census. John's best option was to enlist. He was recorded as 17 years and 10 months old when he signed up for the 4th Queen's Own Light Dragoons in February 1851. But I suspect that he lied about his age, and he hadn't yet turned 16. John spent his first 3 years in Dublin, Woolwich, Norwich, Chobham, Canterbury and finally Exeter. Then in July 1854, the 4th Light Dragoons marched to Plymouth, where 360 men climbed aboard the steamship Simla. They were cheered by thousands as they steamed out of the port. They landed at Yevpatoria 2 months later. The Allied forces, Britain, France and Sardinia, were helping the Ottoman Empire to invade Crimea, aiming to strike directly at Sebastopol, Russia's key naval base on the Black Sea. The Dragoons began their tour supporting the troops in the front lines, occasionally involved in skirmishes or being harassed by the Russian cavalry. 3 days after their arrival, the Allies won a great victory at the Alma River, but the 4th Light Dragoons, still in a supporting role, only did some reconnoitring. That evening, John's company was sent on a foraging expedition. Food was already in short supply. They crossed a ford and collected what they could from the local village. They were just about to return to the camp with their haul when a troop of Russian cavalry appeared from nowhere. The dragoons had to leave all their loot behind. Thankfully, they managed to outrun the Russians and cross back over the ford before the enemy caught up with them. The next day, John had his first taste of battle when his regiment joined the heavy dragoons to rout the Russians at Mackenzie's farm. From there, they proceeded to the outskirts of Balaclava, where they remained for about a month, endlessly harassed by the enemy, but never engaged in full combat. Then suddenly, everything changed. A huge Russian force was deployed 2 miles away at the far end of the plain of Balaclava, defending Sevastopol with gun emplacements down both sides of the North Valley, and an artillery battery blocking the far end. On the morning of the 25th of October 1854, the Russians had sent a sortie out to Woronzow Heights, southeast of the plain. There they had attacked and overcome the Turkish outposts, which were armed with British guns. At the other end of the plain of Balaclava, the Light Brigade of the British Cavalry, with a heavy brigade beside them and the French cavalry in the rear, were all awaiting orders. The Light Brigade stood there for 2 hours before the orders came. They were to prevent the Russians from carrying away the guns. Lord Cardigan, the commander of the Light Brigade, didn't know what had happened at the Woronzow Heights, which was some 3 miles to the southeast. So he assumed that the order referred to the Russian guns amassed at the end of the plain. It sounded ridiculous. Light cavalry should never be used to attack a heavy battery. But he had no choice but to follow his orders. Nothing could have prepared John Edden for what they faced that day. If you haven't already guessed, what I'm about to describe is the famous charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava. John was in the left squadron, front rank, second line, in about the centre of the squadron. 670 horses set off across the plain at a trot. In all the noise and tumult, John didn't hear the trumpeter sounding the charge, but suddenly there was a surge and they all galloped forward. John could scarcely see in front of him. Almost immediately, his comrades began to fall in droves, in front and at both sides. Tennyson wrote, "Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode, and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. In no time at all they were caught at the end of the trap, completely embroiled among the savage Cossacks and the Polish lancers, each man fighting for his life with his sabre, with no commanders in sight. Shots and bullets were flying all around, and everywhere men and horses were falling. If they turned and retreated, they would have to run the same gauntlet on the way back, so they ploughed onwards. John was about 300 yards from the Russian battery when he saw Lord Cardigan on his chestnut horse flying back down the valley at a canter. At that exact moment, John's horse was shot and they both fell to the ground. For a while John was trapped under his horse, but eventually, as the beautiful animal writhed on the ground, John managed to free himself. His sword was bent double, and all he could see around him were dead and dying men and horses. There was no choice but to make his way back through the barrage of fire. John always believed that he was the last man to return from the carnage. Of the 670 men who had started out that morning, only about 195 remained. Another Tamworth man, Private Samuel Parks, had been captured. He was later awarded the Victoria Cross for saving the life of trumpeter Hugh Crawford during the charge. 11 days later, the 4th Light Dragoons were sent to guard a flank at the Battle of Inkerman. Although they were not in the thick of it, They lost 14 more men that day. Then they entered a different kind of hell. The weather worsened, the food ran out, and they had no winter clothes. Many of the men died of cold and starvation. By spring, the remaining soldiers were debilitated and stir-crazy. John was court-martialed in March 1855 for disobedience and using abusive language, and he was sentenced to 50 lashes. Before you judge him, you should know that this wasn't unusual. Over 1,000 lashings were doled out to British soldiers in the Crimean. It was a barbaric means of keeping soldiers compliant, and it did nothing to engender respect for the officers. In the summer of 1855, the Allies were still attempting to take Balaclava before pushing on to Sevastopol. During this time, John wrote a letter to his sister, sending her a few hairs from his horse's tail with the words, "Take care of them, for he is the one that can carry me to battle." Thankfully, he avoided the worst of the action. In October, he was sent on a foraging expedition, which was nearly fatal. One of his commanding officers, Captain Adlington, made the mistake of bringing them out of cover right beside the French outposts. The French, believing it was an enemy attack, launched a barrage of friendly fire. For the second time, John's horse was shot from under him. The men were tempted to fire back on the French, but in the nick of time, Captain Adlington stopped the barrage by shouting out the password, so thankfully no one was killed. There were no further battles. John was court-martialed for a second time in December, this time for disobeying a command and resisting escort. In March 1856, a peace treaty was signed. On the way home, the 4th Dragoons passed through Scutari in Istanbul, where Florence Nightingale was running her famous barrack hospital. They eventually reached home in July 1856, and they were posted to Dublin. John was awarded the British Crimea Medal, with 4 clasps for the 4 major battles of the Crimean War: Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman and Sevastopol. And the Ottoman Sultan awarded him the Turkish Crimean Medal. A print of Lord Cardigan leading the charge of the Light Brigade was presented to each of the survivors by Lady Cardigan. By now, John was over 6 foot tall, with grey eyes, a dashing young man who was more interested in female company than soldiering. He was spending more time than he should with Margaret Edmonds, the Irish girl he was courting, and he was court-martialed twice for being absent without leave. When he married Margaret in April 1861, she was already about 6 months pregnant. John requested a discharge in July 1863. He had been in service for 12 years and he'd clocked up 22 entries in the defaulters book. He was described in rather disparaging terms as an indifferent soldier. John, Margaret and their firstborn, little George, returns to Tamworth and went on to have 10 children. They set up home in Bradbury Square, which had a reputation for disease and squalor. Later they lived at 45 Lichfield Street, and finally they moved next door to number 44. John worked as a labourer for the surveyor, builder and stonemason Charles Clarkson. When the 1881 census was compiled, John was in the cottage hospital, recovering from broken bones, probably the result of an accident at work, while his wife Margaret tried to hold the family together by working as a laundress. He probably set up his little carting business when he came out of hospital, and I'm sure he must have enjoyed working with his own horse. In 1890, there was a welcome development when John began to receive payments from the Light Brigade Relief Fund. As he grew older, he was troubled by chest complaints. One account mentions asthma. In 1897, now in his 60s, he had to give up his carting business due to poor health. Thankfully that year he was awarded an additional pension of 5 shillings a week from the Illustrated Bits Jubilee Fund. John loved to talk about his experiences in the Crimean, especially when he met up with his old comrades at reunions, when he was an honoured guest at local dinners, or when the children called him Old Balaclava and asked to hear his stories. Eventually, John succumbed to bronchitis. His heart gave out on the 15th of October, 1898. 5 days later, he was buried with full military honours in Wigginton Road Cemetery. The funeral was attended by 40 members of the Tamworth Corps of Volunteers and a firing party and a fife and drum marching band from the Lancaster Regiment, who were stationed nearby at Whittington Barracks. The 14-foot-high Derbyshire grit obelisk over his grave was erected in August 1899, designed and built by the stonemason Henry Young Mitchell, and was paid for by public subscription. By 1901, the heavy monument was leaning over to a worrying degree. The burial board donated the vacant plot immediately behind John's grave, and the monument was re-erected there on a more solid foundation. John's body remains in his original grave, plot 1086. His wife, Margaret, died in 1912 and was buried beside him in plot 1087. Both these graves are unmarked. Thanks for joining me today. I hope to see you again soon for another cemetery story. Bye.